And now we have 10 rocks that we're going to use to create our little collection out of. Now what I want to do is go back to that first rock we had created and modified its texture. And we're going to copy this material and just go ahead and paste it on all of these other rocks. So we can go to our rock 4, right mouse click, copy material, and then even hold down shift after selecting our first rock, select the rest, right mouse click, and paste material. So now all of these rocks have the same material. We do see a little bit of color variation though. If you take a look, and you can see that some of our rocks are a little darker than the others. And then we can see our originals, and then some of those variations that will show up with some of those preset rocks. So if that's something that's workable, then you can save out these rocks and use them. Or what you might need to do is modify the material, maybe create new rocks until they're all kind of the same color. Because like I said, there is a color variation that will sometimes show up. So we could keep adding new rocks and then pasting that material to it until we're making sure that we have all of our rocks as part of that same color. And we can see that this one is a little different and more of a kind of a reddish hue to it. So we'll delete that one, and we'll delete the other ones that have that color variation until we're just working with all of our rocks with the same material. Paste that material, and we can see that that one is showing up correctly as well. And this will happen with plants sometimes too. A lot of different plants, like the red maple tree, you'll have variations of the colors of the leaves, and that's all part of the ecosystem generation, so that things are a little more realistic and varied. But in this case, with these rocks, we would want them to be very similar, and we wouldn't want any variation that we would get and that we were seeing before. And we can tell that most of these are all pretty much the same contrast, and they all look really good together, like they're the same type of rock. And we can tell that this one is a little bit of a different color. Go ahead and add another one. Paste our material. And now we have a nice little selection of rocks that are all based on that same color material. And we can see that showing up in the preview. Let's go ahead and do a quick render of this, and we can take a look at all these rocks together. And if we take a look at the render, we can see that all of these look really good together. There's one thing you will notice, and mainly this is because we are using an object standard mapping mode, so that we all have, with all of the different rocks, kind of a darker area on the left side of each one. And that's caused by the fact that we have a material with the same origin on every single rock. Now, because of the size variations and different shape variations, really it's not all that noticeable. But if you did need to kind of modify that, you could create a little bit of an offset, so different materials for the sets of rocks. So using the same one to copy over, but then moving the origin point. So we can take a look at that now. I'll just go ahead and close this out. Let's select this rock in the back. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to call this rock set still underscore 001 or 001 underscore and hit 01 after that. So we have a variation of the same material. But now, if we modify this, it won't modify the rest of our objects because they are separate materials. And what we could really easily do is just go to the Effects tab and adjust the origin of the material. And really, we don't have to do a lot here. I can just type in a couple of values. and we have a 0.5 on the x, negative 25 on the y, and then 20 on the z. And that's enough to offset it, so that's going to be different than what we had before. And basically we're just moving the material within that object space. So what you can do is take this one and maybe copy and paste it over onto the other objects, or some of them that maybe look a little too similar. But in this case, I think it looks really good that we have sort of that same look on most of the rocks, because then they look like the same kind of rock. And like I was saying, with the different size variations, it's really not something that's all that noticeable. And what I've just done is double-clicked on one of our rocks here, because we have a lot of different options for adjusting basically their overall polygon amount, and we have a lot of different modifiers we can use to adjust the rock and modify it before we decide to kind of export this out. In these polygon mesh options, we can adjust whether or not we'd like to bake our illumination. Now, since this is a library that you're going to be using in different scenes, you really wouldn't want to bake this out ahead of time unless you're going to be using it in basically the exact same lighting conditions always. And that'll improve your renders, but it's not always necessary. And in this case, since we are going to be moving it from different scenes, we want to make sure that it has the ability to kind of transition and fit into other scenes. So we're not going to worry about the illumination baking. But what we can do is, if we use the decimate option, we can adjust our overall mesh resolution. We can also set up a dynamic subdivision and increase the polygon amount that way. And if we feel that maybe the rock isn't smooth enough, we can also adjust our smoothing angle, which is currently at 70%. And it seems to work pretty well for most of these rocks, although some of them have some very sharp edges. We're going to take a look at what we have named as rock number 6, and we can see a very sharp edge on the side. So what we can do is increase that smoothing angle to sharpen it, or we could decrease the amount. Really depends. In this case, because of the type of object, sometimes the asileFX will not have an extremely drastic effect, and it's not always going to completely modify a rock. Mainly because if we take a look at the way this is shaped, it's kind of hard to smooth that out with these different angles. So you could either just get rid of that rock and create a new one, and just make sure all of them look really, really good from just about every angle you render it from, because that way later when you import it into your other scenes, you don't have to worry about those problems later. But I think for right now, this is a good little set of rocks that we have. And one thing I want to make sure I do at this point is to save out the scene, and that way we can come back and modify these materials to create our other sets of rocks and our different color variations that we're going to have available. So to save this out, we're just going to go to File and Save As. And I just have a folder called Rock Sets. So we'll just call this rock set underscore 001. And I'm just going to copy and paste this into the title and description. Now, if the material we used to create this rock surface had texture maps or any sort of image file linked to it, we want to make sure that we incorporate the texture map and compress the file. And that way, we don't have to reference images outside of view if we want to open this up on other computers or really modify it later, and maybe we lose those rock files we used to create the texture. In this case, it's an entirely function-based, embedded within View material, so we don't need to worry about these settings. And I'm just going to go ahead and save out this scene. And now we're going to take a look at just saving out these individual rocks in order to create our first little collection that we can use in one of our scenes. And I'm going to start out by selecting all of our rocks. using the move gizmo and just moving them off to the side a little. And now we're going to go through one by one, and if we go up to the top here in the ruler tab, in our first option, which is position, we're going to go ahead and set all of these to 0. Of course, with the z-axis, we might not want to set that to 0 because it looks like that is going to be going below the ground plane. So we'll adjust that, bring it up a little higher, and then drop that object. And one thing we could do with our other objects is basically the same thing. We're going to leave our position options where they are right now and individually set this. We'll just drop all of these objects. And because we had multiple selected, they may not touch the ground correctly. So we can go through each one and just kind of drop it. And we're seeing that it has nothing to drop onto, and that means it's already on the ground plane. So it does look like that even though we had them all selected, they did use the local coordinates and drop them to the ground. If you need to make any rotation options, any changes, now would be the time to do it before you export these out. But now we have just our first object, we have it centered in the scene, and I'm going to save this out. So we can right mouse click, and I'm going to select Save Object. And I just have a folder called Rock Sets, which is the main folder. Within that, I've created another folder called Rock Set 1. We're going to open that up, and now we're going to save each one of these rocks out. And we could just call this set1 underscore rock 001. Actually, we had to add another 0 in there. And you just want to make sure that you have enough zeros to make how many rocks you're going to have. This would give us the ability to make thousands of them without having to worry about any of the numbering problems. And I'm just going to copy this and just kind of paste that into the title and description. Once again, if you used texture maps within the material you created for the rock, you're going to want to make sure that you select Incorporate Texture Maps and Compress File. But now that this is set up, we're saving it as a VOB file, which is the View Object file. Click Save, and now it's going to give us a little preview of our object. We can move this around, right mouse click to rotate, and then left mouse click to move and pan around. And that we can get a good idea of what the actual shape of the rock is going to look like, and kind of set it up to fit the scene, really depending on what you're working with. Basically, in this case, the defaults are really going to be fine. I'll just go ahead and modify that. We could also change the background, whether or not we want it checkered. We can change the ground color. And in this case, I might want to change it to that green if we're going to be using it on a lot of grassy surfaces. If you're going to be using it mainly on mountainous surfaces, you might want to create a ground color to match that. That way you can really see what it looks like in contrast with that color. But I think this is set up pretty good. We'll just leave it at the default. I'm going to click OK, and now we have that rock saved out. So what I'm going to do is just move this one out of the way, go down the list, select our next one. In the position options, change that to 0 and 0 on the X and the Y. We've already dropped it, so we don't need to worry about the Z axis. You can right mouse click, save our object, and we'll set that to a number 2. Save it, and we're just going to go through each one of these objects and save them out individually. And then we can take a look at the set in a clear scene and figure out what we want to do with it. I've cleared out the rocks in our scene, and now we can take a look and load up the collection into view so we can use it. I'm going to go to File and Load Object, and now these are all of the objects that just come with view, and we need to add in a new collection. So we're going to go to the lower left and select New Collection. And now we can just navigate to that folder that we had saved our objects in. I'm going to select Rock Sets. And then we can change the name if we want to. We don't necessarily have to use the folder name. And now we can see that come up, asileFX rock sets. And we can select our folder, and now we can see all of our different rocks that we had saved out. And these are now available for creating an ecosystem. And I'm just going to go ahead and load one of these in to our scene, and we can take a look and see that object. I'm just going to hit delete, and let's take a look at just adding this to a little bit of an ecosystem, just a terrain, something very simple. Go ahead and add in a standard terrain. I'm going to scale this up. And we're just going to be putting this on a grass surface, which is our default, that blends into our ground plane. And now we can open up the material, check ecosystem, and that adds our ecosystem layer. Go to the general tab, add, and we want to select object, making sure we're not using rock because that's going to be those default rocks. And now we can select each one of these rocks and load them in to our ecosystem. And really, depending on the overall amount of information you have in the texture, can determine how long it takes to load this object in, and how long it will take to prepare the ecosystem for that object. So that took a little while to load that first one in. We can go in, load in the next object, and you just want to go through, and we'll come back and have all of these loaded in. We now have all 9 of our rocks loaded in, so our entire set has been added to this ecosystem. We can go ahead and just click populate, and now we're going to see all of these rocks being generated. If you also notice, we do have, it looks like one of those rocks with a different color, and it looks like that one was not weeded out from the other ones. So we do have that slight variation, and if we take a look at these rocks, we could probably figure out which one it is, or whether or not it's basically more than one rock that's doing this. And in a situation like this, a really easy way to find out which object is causing that problem is to go through the presence of all of these objects, and we're going to set them all to 0 just to begin with. I'm going to click OK. We need to go back to our main camera view because I had changed that. And now if I populate, we can see that some of them are not really being overwhelmed because they're all set to 0. So we'll set our presence on the first rock to 1, and that one should be showing up more than the others, but it looks like maybe that might not be enough, so we'll go ahead and change that to presence of 10. And in this case, for this object, this really isn't working very well to show us which object is showing up incorrectly. So I'm going to go back and just change our presence back to 1 for all of these objects, and we're going to be adjusting the scale. And I'm going to give, to start out, a scale of 0.5 to all of our different rock objects. We can just click and type 0.5, repopulate, and now I'm going to go through and make some of these larger, and then the larger object will show up and we'll be able to see which one it is. So let's start by changing our first object to a scale of 5. We can see that has really increased in size. And what we can also notice is that that built-in material that we had for the rock, where we have some sort of red-looking rocks, seems to be something that's kind of built into all of our different objects. So even though we saved that other one out, we're still having some of these show up with that red object, and we can also see some of the smaller ones are doing that as well. So that is a variation that we have on our rock that we may need to remove by taking kind of other measures. And this is another reason why I made sure that I was working with just a black and white non-colored object, is so that we can see this when it happens. Because sometimes you won't run into this problem. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is go back to that scene where we have all of our objects. I'll just go ahead and load that up. And now we have that scene open. What we can also see is that smoothing angle that we changed is creating a very polygoned look on that one rock. I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and we're going to increase that smoothing angle to smooth that rock out. And now, because that material is sort of embedded into our rock objects, what we want to make sure we do is change this type of material or type of object, and we can easily do that basically by baking it. And not the illumination like we were talking about before, but the actual object itself. So we'll select each one of our objects, and we can do this the same way we did when we saved it out. We select all of the objects, kind of move them off to the side, and then work on them one by one. So we'll select our first object. We're going to go ahead and move that to 0 on the X and Y, drop it. Now we can right mouse click and bake it to polygons. And now we can adjust the overall resolution. As we can see though, as we move the slider, it's really not changing the quality. Go ahead and click OK. And now we have a baked object. And we can see in the layers that it's showing up differently. Where the rest of our objects have a little rock next to them, which is showing that it is a rock object. Well, the new one we just baked is now showing up with an object icon next to it. So now that that is taken care of, we can move that off to the side, or we can save it out first. But if we continue down through our layer, right mouse click, bake it to polygons, and we're just going to do that for all of these rocks and then resave them out. And that way, when we go back to create that ecosystem, we can see the change and how that really was embedded into our rock and how we can change that. So that's something really important to pay attention to. So I'm going to go ahead and save all these out after baking them to polygons and making sure they're an object file and no longer the default rock. And now that all of these rocks are saved out and converted, we also want to make sure we just save this scene. So if we decide to create a new set of materials and a new set of rocks for our scenes, then we don't have to go through and bake them all again. All we have to worry about is the material. So let's go ahead and just delete all of these rocks from our scene. And we're going to add in a standard terrain just as we did before. And we'll open up the material, turn on the ecosystem, and we can add our objects. And now we can also see that since they are no longer rock objects, they're actually loading in way quicker than they were before, where it was taking a little bit of extra time because they were still those rock objects. So now that they're baked to polygons and really their own object, just a very low polygon object, they're loading in extremely quickly. So I'm just going to finish this up, load in all of our rocks, and now all of our rocks are loaded in. You can go ahead and click populate, and now we can see the color is even throughout all of our rocks, unlike it was before, where it was still based on that rock object. Now we can see with some of these, they may be going above our surface, it looks like, but that could just be an OpenGL preview error, which it looks like it is, and basically that's because our terrain itself is not entirely showing up to its full resolution. But let's take a look back at our material. We'll increase the density of all of these rock objects, and if we go into scaling orientation, we want to make sure that we can adjust our rotation level, and we're going to select rotation on all axes, and give a maximum rotation, capping out the slider. We could also make a size variation. If we go to non-uniform, we can stretch some of these out on different axes. We could also change the overall scaling. And then of course we can use anything in the environment tab to really set where we want these objects to show up, whether or not we want them just at a high altitude. And we can see that on the top. And then we'll increase the fuzziness. We could have them fading down our little landscape here. But this is a really good way to make sure that we have all of our objects and all of our rocks the same color. And we have a nice little library we can use now to populate these different ecosystems without having to worry about all of those other textures that will load in by default. And we have a lot more control now. Another thing we might want to do is with density, I'm going to change the offset from surface to proportional to the size of the instance, and then populate it below the surface a little. And that way our rocks are going to go into our terrain, and they're going to go into it a relative amount based on their size. So if it was absolute offset from the surface, then some of the really small rocks are going to be completely through the terrain, which we can see right now, but the larger ones, we can still see the tops of them. But if it's proportional to the size of the individual rock or the instance, then it's going to be percentage based on each rock. And the more we want to pull that down, we can just bring it below the surface even more, so the rocks are really going into the terrain if we wanted to. And you can really just kind of play around with that until it looks the way you want it. We can also use these rocks to paint our ecosystems and just load them in the normal way we would for creating any sort of ecosystem. First, let's go ahead and just do a quick render of this rock set, and we'll take a look and see how the scene looks, and then we can load up some of these rocks into our painted ecosystem or ecosystem painter, and we can take a look at that. And taking a look at the render, we can see that all of our rocks look really good together. There's no overall color variation that we don't want. And before we go back to create a new surface, I also want to show you another reason why I have this entirely black and white and just gray rocks. And that's because instead of going and creating a new material, which we would mainly do just for the bump and overall luminosity value, just where we kind of have the darker areas, what we can do is take our ecosystem and just change the color of our ecosystem itself by using the variable color option. Now, since they're all black and white, we don't need to worry about any overlapping colors to give us colors we don't want. Where with some of the default rocks we had kind of orange areas, and when we tried to overlap that color with something maybe a little darker, we end up with still some of those colors showing through. So this way, with just the black and white rocks, we can easily change the color overall of our different objects just by using the variable color option. So we're going to edit our color map. And let's go ahead and change this. And let's make these rocks green. And now what we can see that's happening is all of our rocks are now showing up blue. And that's because the different blend that we have and the way this is being generated and created is a little bit different. So we'll take a look at that overall option. We're going to edit our function. And we want to basically drive this with a function. So we're going to add a color map. And we could load in a variety of different color maps. But in this case, I'm going to choose to just go with a solid color. And now it looks like we have these two colors conflicting. So I'm going to edit this color map and change it back to black, repopulate, and now we're seeing that we have this black color instead of the green. If we edit our function, we can still see that color map is green. Go back and edit this color again. Let's this time change this to red and just see what happens. And now we see a very bright green. So let's change this color to white, repopulate, and now we have this white color. And we can tell that this color map we have within the function really doesn't seem to be impacting the overall color very much. So we're going to change that to black, populate, and we're still seeing that white. So now when we adjust this color, let's go ahead and make that green and populate. We're seeing the blue impact again. If we change this color to blue and populate, now it's showing up as red. Edit that color map again. We'll change that to a red color, populate, and now we're seeing green. So these colors are really a little bit off at the moment. We'll go ahead and edit this function, edit our color, change it to white, which is now kind of changing our other color, which we'll go ahead and change to a deeper red. And if we populate it, we're seeing green. So we're ending up with a little bit of issues here in our overall color in the way this is being populated. I'm going to reset our overall color and populate that. Go back to our variable color, and we'll try to change that to green again and populate. So it looks like we are just running into a few issues here with getting this to show up in the color that we're choosing. And as we can see, I turned this to green and we have this showing up currently as sort of a red. So let's go ahead and adjust that overall color to a green, which is turning our other one to blue and is showing up as red. So we're just having a few problems with that right now. So what I'm going to do is turn off the variable color, populate. I'm going to reset the overall color, bring us back to our gray. And now this problem could be caused by the fact that we used a luminosity shift instead of a black and white color map. That could be part of the issue, which we could always change. But what we can do is just use our overall color to kind of change some of these, and we're seeing that it's really giving us colors that we don't want. I'm going to reset that. And if we use color at low density, what it's going to do is change our color on the bottom, or our lower densities, because right now we have a very dense area on top, and then our lower density would be more of the bottom rocks. And we could change that color. Let's go ahead and change that to blue and repopulate, and now we're seeing red. So we're having kind of the same issue there. So either what you can do is just kind of play around with this until you get a color that you're looking for, because it looks like we have a few opposite colors kind of showing up. Really not the way we want it to, obviously, because we want to be able to choose the exact color. So when this is working correctly, sometimes it can depend. Sometimes you can close out the scene, reopen it up, and then you won't have any problems with it. But it looks like right now, with the way the rocks were designed, we're having a little bit of an issue, and it may be, like I said, that material where we just need to connect it to a black and white color map rather than doing that luminosity shift. That could solve our problem, or it might not. which is why we have our other method of changing the color on our rocks. And that is the ability to just create another material on another set of rocks. So let's go ahead and open that scene back up and our first rock set. And we're going to go to this material, go ahead and edit that. And if we go into our function, we can see the way we use the HLS shift for that. What I could do is just connect, go ahead and delete our filter and this constant node, and connect our color map to that fractal, remove the HLS shift, connect our color output to the color map. Let's go ahead and load in or edit our color map. First color, we're just going to set this to black. We're going to go and click, and we can drag all the way to the left so our position is -1, and create our new key color. If we need to, we can reverse this effect. In order to get our rock to look sort of the way it did before. So we could do that if in the case that the luminosity shift was throwing off kind of that overall coloration. Or what we can do is just modify this color now and load in different color maps. So I'll just go ahead and load in one of the natural color maps from the asileFX 300 color map collection. And there's a lot of different ones available that work really well for creating rocks. And I'm going to load in one with a little bit of color. And we'll use one of these brownish yellow. We'll go ahead and take a look. And now we have a new color rock that we can take this material, copy it, and save it, or paste it onto our other rocks. Go back in, load another color map. And now we have another type of rock we can use, a new material. We can adjust the bump maps, change what kind of filters we're using and what kind of fractals to change the overall bump. But once we have the basic shapes of these rocks set up and the scene, which is already ready to go, we just modify one material, and then I can go ahead and copy it. We can select all of our other objects, and then paste it. And we'll take a look here. And because I had more than one type of material that wasn't showing up correctly, so now we can paste it, and we have the same material on all of these different objects. Go through one by one, save them out to create a new set of rocks that you can use for your scenes. And I'm going to go ahead and just load in those other objects that we had saved out. I'm going to open up the Ecosystem Painter window, and we can add in each one of those objects and the different rocks so we can paint our ecosystem using these objects. And I'll just load in a couple of them, because you don't always have to use every single rock in the collection. You could just pick and choose some of them, just as long as you keep the colors you want together in the same folders. You shouldn't have any problems kind of jumping around and selecting different rocks. And now we have paint what? A bit of everything, and that way it's going to paint all of these different rocks and not just a selected item. And we'll change this to the brush mode, and now we can go in here and just kind of paint some rocks into our scene. Take a look at the render, we can see those showing up. We could also use the color that we have in here. And we'll change this to kind of a greenish look. Go ahead and paint those in. And now we can see we're having the same problem with this color. So it might really have to do with that surface on these rocks, because we have it set to green and it's showing up as blue. So it might have to do with that luminosity shift, but you can change the surface just as I did before and just edit that material and see if that will help fix that problem, since it is showing up both in the Painter and the regular ecosystem windows. And these rock libraries are useful for other things as well. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. And if I wanted to vary the shape of a terrain, let's just say we have a standard terrain, what I could do is copy the material from our terrain and paste it onto those rock objects and save out a set. And then when we populate an ecosystem or paint one with those rocks with the exact same material and have them match up, we'll have a lot more variation with our different terrains. We can get some really neat looking effects that way. So it's very useful to create these little rock libraries for different scenes, or even just creating a library for a specific scene. Whether or not you want to create little smooth round rocks, you could do that. You could also create different types of gems. So it's a very flexible technique, and there's really a lot you can do with it.